Dr. Peter Turchin is a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Connecticut. He sees signs that worry him in our civilizations too, and they're more than intuitive apprehensions. Professor Turchin uses mathematics to study both human behaviour and historical events. And to paraphrase Betty Davis in the movie All About Eve, fasten your seatbelts, there's a bumpy road ahead. Peter, good morning.
Good morning.
Before we talk about the science of this, looking into the future and so on, it has a name, yes?
That's right. Cliodynamics.
Cliodynamics from?
It's a word combined from Clio, or Clio, the muse of history in Greek mythology, and dynamics, which is a science of change. So together, these two words mean historical dynamics. It's essentially an approach to doing history as science, which means, building mathematical models for theories, collecting data and testing models with data.
Excellent. And a bit of romance to the title, with Clio being the muse of history. And Cliodynamics, spearheaded by you, I think, is a steadily growing discipline, isn't it?
That's right. And fortunately, I'm not alone. We have a very good group of people studying history as science. And yes, I would say over the last 15 years or so, this scientific movement has grown quite dramatically.
How do you apply Cliodynamics? Can you explain it in brief, please?
Sure. So if you think about this, let's talk about history, first of all. In the United States, history is not considered to be a science. It's one of the humanities. So historians don't really ask questions about why human societies, what general principles govern the dynamics and evolution of human societies. So the idea is to bring the scientific method in all its awful majesty to questions about why empires rise, why they fall, why religions grow or wither, and why populations go through booms and busts.
Right.
So this is the type of questions. All these questions are dynamics, right? Because we're talking about change with time. Empires start small, they grow, then they reach some kind of an equilibrium, and then they decline or even get or even collapse quite dramatically. So this is all about change.
Yep.
And it turns out that in sciences like physics and biology, dynamics has been a long-established discipline, and there is actually quite an apparatus, mathematical and analytical apparatus, which we can bring to bear on questions of history.
Okay, can you give us an example of how you would bring the apparatus to bear, for example, on the Mayan civilization, Rome, the Mongols, whatever example you might choose?
Let's take Rome, which is quite familiar to most of your listeners. So Rome started as a very small polity on the Italian peninsula, roughly speaking, in the 8th century BC. And about 1,000 years later, it was a mighty empire which controlled over 5 million square kilometers. All right. So one way we could actually trace the imperial dynamics of Rome is by measuring how much territory this polity has controlled at any particular point in time. Right. All right. Now, but before we talk more about Rome, let's step back. Actually, in science, we don't really necessarily ask questions about any particular instances. So why did Rome become a mighty empire? And also, why did Rome collapse? These are very interesting questions, all right? But we are interested in more general questions. Why do large empires rise, and why do they collapse? And so Rome becomes one of the examples of such dynamics. And so in a scientific approach, you want to study a number of such events because you want to distill what are the general features underlying collapses of large empires.
Okay, and in that scientific approach where you study a number of general features, do there turn out to be laws of history as such relating to decline and rise?
Well, laws of history obviously has, a a very ambitious aspect to it. But yes, essentially, if there are laws of physics and laws of biology, why shouldn't there are laws of history?
Okay. How specifically do you dig into them? I mean, the Roman Livy thought that a society which glorifies its chefs is a society in decline, and you turn on the TV and we glorify our chefs, i.e. our pursuits may have become trivial. It's a trivial example, actually, but can Cliodynamics operate in that sort of way?
Well, actually, the question of the imperial collapse has interested thinkers for thousands of years. So what we have now, we have a number of theories. And one German historian, Alexander Demand, about 20 years ago published a book where he actually collected together over 230 explanations for why Roman Empire collapsed. So what we see here, we see a multiplication of explanations, but in science, it's not enough to propose an explanation. Actually, progress in science is measured by dead theories.
Okay. Obviously, there's a lot to consider when you look at Rome. Can I come to the present? And there's a lot to consider here, and we are warned fairly regularly about being on a headlong and profligate sort of course, and not just by environmentalists. There's a lot of gloom around. What do you see and why in the years ahead, please?
Well, let me go back just a bit to what we were talking about Rome. So in general, our society, United States, in which I live, it's not that different from Rome. It's a large-scale society. It's actually an imperial society, arguably. We have a distribution of power. So there are elites who hold a lot of power, and there are people, common people, who don't have a lot of power. And so these relations between the elites and population, they actually turned out to be a key mechanism explaining why empires in general collapse. So that's a big part of the explanation why the Roman Empire collapsed. And also, if you apply these ideas to the United States, you can see that you could actually predict that kinds of troubles that we see in the United States actually a decade or two ago. In fact, I did. I published a paper about 10 years ago in which I outlined the trends that I and my colleagues saw, and we saw where these trends would lead. And the prediction was that in the early 2020s, United States would experience a serious period of political turbulence.
Yes, okay, and I did know that. I knew that you'd written that. It's not just the United States, actually. The statistics, I think, courtesy of Oxfam out of Davos in the last few days, suggest the world's billionaires are getting richer at an exponential rate, while nearly half the world's population exists on $5.50 a day. So this is global, not just US, yes?
Correct, but I think that talking about the whole world, it's not the best way to think about the troubles our days, because the nation states actually are still very relevant. And what this means is that all these different trends actually they are on different time clocks, if you will. All right. So in China, for example, you don't see serious trends suggesting that China would collapse anytime soon. All right. Whereas in the United States, we see very serious trends that have been developing over the last 20 or 30 years. So I suggest that what we need to do is we need to look at one country at a time rather than necessarily think about the global humanity.
Okay, and I'll get back to the China versus US example, if I may. But how much of what happens today is relevant to what has happened in the past and the data in your global history data bank, I think it's called? Because aren't our societies more complex, certainly in our technology and therefore our transactions? Aren't they more complex than the societies of the Romans or the Franks or the Zulus or whomever?
Yes, of course. Our societies today are very different from societies such as Roman society or ancient China. But ever since the first states arose about 5,000 years ago, there has been some basic similarity between state-organized societies. And specifically, this organization the centralization of power, which leads to quite serious inequalities arising between people with power, elites, and the rest of the population. And so these types of contradictions, if you will, using Marxian language, they have been with us over the last 5,000 years. And even though they work in somewhat different ways, they at some very basic level, they remain similar. And so we can actually gain a lot of understanding of the predicament that we find ourselves in today by studying other historical societies.
I understand, but the British Empire expanded, for example, even while there was phenomenal inequality at the bottom of society. So when does that inequality, which a lot of people have been talking about for a long time, when does that foresee instability in your view?
Okay, well, first of all, I and other people in Cliodynamics, we don't argue that inequality directly leads to state collapse. So inequality is more of an indicator of other more deep processes. And those processes are basically threefold. First of all, it's the actual immiseration of the population, when the standard of living of the general population declines, all right? Secondly, it's the situation where what we call elite overproduction. When there are too many elite aspirants, people who want elite positions, and they start competing for them, and eventually this competition turns into conflict. And thirdly, it's the health of the state, which is measured in how much taxes it gets and how much it has to spend. So these three components, popular immiseration, intra-elite competition and conflict, and the health of the state, they typically work together because it's a dynamical system. Each part affects the other part. And as the trends, the negative trends get worse in each of these compartments, so to speak, the overall social system becomes very fragile and vulnerable to collapse or a very significant outbreak of political violence.
Yuval Harari, I think, foresees a large useless class of people wailing and gnashing their teeth outside the city walls. And I think Thomas Piketty wondered if we are, in fact, returning to the days of nobles and serfs, and that a big middle class was a transitory phenomenon now in decline. So I guess the argument I'm putting, or the riposte I'm putting to you, is that the elites perhaps now have all the algorithms. They can invent all sorts of technology to protect themselves so you can't storm the Bastille, as the French commoners once did. Is that a factor?
Sure. So one thing that should worry all of us is the possibility of robotic armies, so that people who have a lot of wealth can actually insulate themselves from the rest of the society. But it is not so much unprecedented. The changes in military technology have actually pushed societies to become more democratic or less democratic, all right? So we see a democratic Athens. That's because the state had to arm most of its citizenry. But during the Middle Ages, a small group of knights who were so well armored and so well armed they could control 100 times as many peasants as themselves. And so that was a very potent force pushing those societies to become much less democratic and much more the opposite.
Yeah, I understand. All right, so you don't think that'll happen this time? You don't think that the elites, the ever-increasingly wealthy of the world, that tiny minority, can actually protect themselves forever and keep us stable? You think that we've got trouble on the way, yeah?
Yes, I do think so. But, well, if the elites actually manage to wall themselves off, then that's going to be quite a dismal situation for the 99%.
Okay.
That would not be a great outcome. I'm not saying that revolution would be a great outcome. But this technological nightmare or dream from the point of view of the wealthy and powerful, right, that is actually sounds like a social dystopia to me.
As you've alluded to, you saw this a long time ago, and I think you saw it by studying the 1970s, actually. Why did you think, and why do you think, that political disorder and social volatility might reach their heights in the 2020s? Why do you think it's so close?
Well, first of all, I should mention that I and my colleagues have studied about 30 different, in quite detail, about 30 different past societies. And so the theory that we built, which was actually translated into mathematical models, and it makes predictions, and we test them on previous examples of state collapse. With the United States, my study goes back to the very origins of the Republic. The United States went through one of these cycles, the structural demographic cycles, which culminated in the Civil War, and then a lot of trouble during the 1910s and 20s. All right. And so this, perversely, this period of turbulence was the one actually that frightened the governing elites of the United States and forced them to adopt a bunch of laws that actually reduced the level of conflict between, let's say, workers and capitalists. And so that really introduced the period when the popular well-being has grown very rapidly and sustainably from, roughly speaking, 1930s to 1970s. But the new generation of elites came to power in the 1970s, and they forgot all those troubles. And also there were some other forces that pushed them to become more selfish. They were very worried about their incomes and wealth declining. And so they reversed essentially the whole machinery of the state. And that's when essentially that's where the roots of the current troubles are.
Okay.
So,
do you think, though, that a prompted solution rather than a dramatic one is possible? I mean, arguably, that World War II helped galvanize the US and end the Depression of the 1930s. Do you think there's a cataclysm of some sort that is necessary, or do you think we can be enlightened and change course, of our own volition?
Well, I think that Piketty overstates the importance of world wars. He only looks at the last cycle, but if you look at more cycles, you will see that you don't need external wars. What you really need is internal turbulence, an internal war that brings about more equitable institutions in the society. So I'm actually, I sounded somewhat pessimistic a bit ago. But in principle, I believe that we collectively can actually solve these problems without violence. All right. So, and this is where Cliodynamics can help.
Yes, Cliodynamics can point the way if, of course, the politicians listen to you, and if unless we've set in play larger forces that we can't quite assuage in time. You talked about China versus the US, and of course China has the advantage of a command economy, doesn't it? Whereas the US gives voice to all its dissent. But mighty empires, autocratic ones, can also collapse. So if you were a betting man, and I know you use mathematics, you don't read entrails, but how do you think it will play out? I'm inferring that you think the US will go into decline if nothing is done, and that will have dramatic effect on the entire world.
Well, and so China and US are very interesting cases because they are in different phases of these long-term cycles. China had its own experience of state fragmentation and collapse from, roughly speaking, 1850 through 1950s. All right, and so it has been on the up, rising trend in the cycle, and that means that it's out of phase with the United States. So as the United States goes into decline, China actually has an excellent chance of becoming the next world dominating power for a while. And then, of course, eventually this process will catch up with them too. But that may be 50 or 100 years in the future.
Okay, so this is going to happen, if not arrested, sometime in the 2020s. That's when the forces will build up sufficiently. We have talked mainly about inequality, which I don't think we have to explain to anybody. We all understand that it exists and what it is. Is that the primary mover here? Because I imagine Cliodynamics, well, I know it studies a host of factors, but is that the single central problem?
No, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, it's more of a surface indicator. So the driving forces are actually declining standard of living for the population and increasing number of elite aspirants. So inequality is basically a measure of, as you can see, the elites pulling away from the rest of the population, inequality increases. But the actual deep factors that drive instability are popular immiseration, right, which translates into mass mobilization potential, and intra-elite competition, which undermines the consensus on which all governments, but especially democratic ones, have to be governed.
And we can see those signs, if we choose to read them the way you do, all over the world at the moment. So how long have we got, please?
Because it's like an earthquake. You can see that the pressure is growing, but precisely to predict when you have a major tremor, that's probably impossible. So all we can do is that our mathematical models show that the pressure has been growing over the last 20 or 30 years, and several mechanisms will coincide so that the maximum pressure will be during the early 2020s, right? That's when the social system is its most fragile, and that's when there could be major tremors.
Just a quick question before we go. Do you talk to politicians about this? I know your work is widely read, but do you think people are taking enough notice of Cliodynamics?
I have not talked to any politicians, and politicians right now are very busy in their own infighting. So I don't think they are in the mood to listen to academics who would tell them that they should stop actually doing what they're doing and start working on creating some kind of a consensus. All right, the idea of consensus between people supporting Trump and anti-Trump people seems a little bit unrealistic at the moment.
So you could be like Cassandra in ancient Troy. You could be seeing the future quite accurately, but people aren't taking heed.
Yeah, right. Or Isaac Asimov's fictional hero, Harry Seldon. So we should probably move away to some remote island. But New Zealand, by the way, is not going to be immune to all these forces, unfortunately.
No, and we sense that, I think. Very good to talk to you. We're out of time, but a fascinating conversation, and thank you very much for talking to us.
It's my pleasure.